If you've ever known an empath, or perhaps if you are one yourself, you've probably noticed something that confuses almost everyone around them. People often mistake their patience for weakness. They assume that because someone doesn't argue, doesn't retaliate, or doesn't immediately walk away, they must lack confidence or strength. But psychology tells a very different story. Enduring emotional discomfort for the sake of preserving connection is not something most people can do for very long. It requires an enormous amount of emotional regulation, self-control, and hope. The problem is that those same qualities can become the very things that keep an empath trapped in unhealthy relationships far longer than they should be. One of the biggest misconceptions about empathy is that it's simply being kind. It isn't. Empathy is the ability to accurately perceive another person's emotional state often before that person fully understands it themselves. An empath doesn't just hear your words. They notice the hesitation before your sentence. They recognize the tension in your voice, the expression that flashes across your face for half a second, and the contradiction between what you're saying and what you're actually feeling. Their brain is constantly gathering emotional information, often without conscious effort. This creates a fascinating psychological dilemma. When you can clearly see another person's pain, it's much harder to judge their behavior objectively. Instead of asking, "What did they do?" the empath naturally asks, "What happened to them that made them act this way?" That single question changes everything. Instead of seeing cruelty, they see woundedness. Instead of seeing manipulation, they imagine fear. Instead of seeing betrayal, they search for hidden suffering. Now, understanding someone's pain is a remarkable human quality, but understanding is not the same as excusing. This is where many empaths quietly lose themselves. Because every time someone hurts them, they instinctively begin building explanations. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they had a difficult childhood. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Those explanations feel compassionate. They feel morally right. Yet, over time, they become dangerous because explanations slowly replace accountability. Think about how many relationships survive, not because trust is strong, but because one person keeps rewriting the story. Every broken promise becomes an accident. Every disrespectful comment becomes a misunderstanding. Every emotional wound becomes something to forgive before it's even acknowledged. This isn't naive optimism. It's emotional pattern recognition working against itself. Empaths are remarkably good at detecting potential. They don't only see who someone is today, they constantly imagine who that person could become if they healed, matured, or finally faced their own emotional struggles. In many ways, they fall in love with possibility just as much as reality. But relationship cannot survive on potential. You cannot build a healthy future with a version of someone that exists only inside your imagination. This is one of the hardest lessons an empath ever learns. Psychologists often discuss something called emotional investment. The more energy we pour into someone, the harder it becomes to leave them, even when the relationship becomes unhealthy. We begin protecting our investment because admitting the truth feels like admitting that years of patience accomplished nothing. Empaths experience this even more intensely because their investment isn't measured only in time. It's measured in emotional labor. They've listened for countless hours. They've comforted during every crisis. They've absorbed anxiety that wasn't theirs to carry. They've celebrated victories that weren't their own. They've spent years becoming the emotional safety net for everyone else. Imagine carrying invisible weight every single day. No one sees it because emotional labor doesn't leave bruises. It leaves exhaustion. And here's what's fascinating. Many empaths don't even recognize how tired they are because caring has become part of their identity. They believe being available is who they are. Saying yes becomes automatic. Fixing problems becomes instinctive. They become so accustomed to carrying emotional weight that peace itself begins to feel unfamiliar. This is why boundaries often feel uncomfortable to an empath at first. A boundary can feel selfish when your identity has been built around self-sacrifice. Yet psychologically, healthy boundaries aren't walls that keep people out. They're filters that determine what deserves access to your emotional energy. Without those filters, every emotional demand feels equally urgent. Every crisis becomes your responsibility. Every disappointment becomes yours to repair. Eventually, you stop living your own life because you're too busy managing everyone else's. Here's something worth considering. Emotional exhaustion rarely arrives dramatically. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly through thousands of small moments. One more favor, one more apology accepted. One more conversation where your feelings are pushed aside. One more night spent worrying about someone who rarely worries about you. Individually, those moments seem insignificant. Collectively, they reshape an entire personality. The empath who was once joyful becomes constantly tired. The person who once smiled easily begins smiling less. Not because they stopped caring, because caring without reciprocation slowly drains the very qualities that made them extraordinary. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the people receiving that endless patience often assume it will never end. Human beings adapt quickly to what is consistently available. If someone always forgives, we begin expecting forgiveness. If someone always understands, we stop explaining ourselves. If someone always stays, we unconsciously believe they always will. That assumption is the beginning of every emotional tragedy, because patience is not an unlimited resource. It feels unlimited only to the people who never have to supply it. Every empath has an internal reservoir of emotional energy. For some, it lasts months. For others, years. But no reservoir is infinite. Every disappointment withdraws something. Every betrayal takes another piece. Every ignored boundary quietly lowers the waterline, until one day there is simply nothing left to give. The remarkable thing is that this depletion rarely produces anger first. It produces clarity. And clarity is far more powerful than outrage because it doesn't seek revenge. It simply recognizes reality without illusion. By the time an empath reaches that realization, the journey toward their final stage has already begun, even if no one around them has noticed it. Remember, this patience is one of the greatest strengths a person can possess. But when patience costs you your own peace, it has stopped being compassion and started becoming self-abandonment. Now, here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because most people imagine that when someone reaches their limit, there will be obvious signs. They expect arguments to become louder, emotions to become more dramatic, or conflict to become impossible to ignore. But that isn't usually how an empath operates. In fact, one of the greatest mistakes people make is believing silence means everything is fine. Psychologically, silence can mean many different things. It can represent peace, confidence, reflection, or it can signal emotional withdrawal. The challenge is that from the outside, those states often look identical. An empath rarely announces that they're reaching their limit. Instead, they begin making quiet adjustments that almost nobody notices. Think back to every relationship that ended suddenly. Chances are it wasn't actually sudden. It only appeared sudden to the person who wasn't paying attention. Empaths are notorious for giving silent warnings instead of dramatic ultimatums. Not because they fear confrontation, but because confrontation is usually their last choice, not their first. They believe people should want to understand, not be forced to understand. So, instead of demanding change, they observe. They wait. They hope. They give space for someone to recognize the problem on their own. That's why the first warning isn't anger. It's effort. Or more accurately, the slow disappearance of effort. The empath who once checked in every day suddenly forgets to send the message. The one who always asked how you're feeling starts answering with short responses. The person who remembered every important detail begins forgetting birthdays, anniversaries, or conversations that once mattered deeply. From the outside, these changes seem small. From a psychological perspective, they're enormous. Because attention is emotional investment made visible. Where your attention goes, your emotional energy follows. When an empath begins withdrawing that attention, they're not punishing anyone. They're protecting themselves from continuing an investment that no longer feels emotionally safe. Most people completely misread this shift. They assume the empath has finally become relaxed. They think they're not complaining anymore, so everything must be okay. But here's the paradox. Complaints often indicate hope. Someone who argues with you is still trying to improve the relationship. They're still emotionally invested enough to believe change is possible. The moment someone stops arguing altogether, the emotional equation changes. An empath doesn't stop speaking because they stop noticing problems. They stop speaking because they stop believing words will make a difference. That's an entirely different psychological state. Research on communication consistently shows that people repeat themselves when they believe they're not being heard. Eventually, however, something changes. The brain conserves energy by abandoning strategies that repeatedly fail. If explaining your feelings produces the same result every time, your mind gradually concludes that explaining them is no longer worth the effort. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. The human brain is remarkably efficient at protecting itself from repeated emotional disappointment. So instead of expressing frustration, the empath quietly reduces exposure to the source of that frustration. They answer fewer phone calls. They spend less time initiating conversations. They become emotionally present in fewer situations. Not because they don't care, because caring has become expensive. Another warning people frequently ignore is emotional neutrality. Many assume emotional neutrality means maturity. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it signals exhaustion. There's a profound difference between someone who has mastered their emotions and someone who has simply run out of emotional energy. From the outside, both appear calm. Internally, they couldn't be more different. One is peaceful, the other is empty. This distinction matters because exhausted people often appear incredibly composed. They no longer react to insults. They don't chase explanations. They don't demand accountability. People interpret this as forgiveness. Often, it's acceptance. Not acceptance that the behavior is okay, but acceptance that the behavior is unlikely to change. Once an empath reaches that conclusion, something subtle but powerful begins happening inside them. Their expectations disappear. That sounds harmless, but psychologically it's one of the biggest shifts imaginable. Relationships are built on expectations, trust, consistency, respect, mutual effort. When expectations disappear, emotional attachment starts dissolving alongside them. The empath no longer expects support, no longer expects honesty, no longer expects understanding. And because disappointment requires expectation, disappointment slowly disappears too. That sounds like healing. Sometimes it's actually the beginning of emotional detachment. Here's another warning sign almost nobody recognizes. The empath becomes harder to manipulate. Not because they've become suspicious, because they've become observant. There's an important difference. Suspicion looks for enemies. Observation simply sees patterns. After enough repeated experiences, the empath stops focusing on promises and starts focusing on consistency. Words lose influence, behavior becomes the only language they trust. That shift changes everything. Manipulation depends on emotional urgency. It depends on convincing someone to ignore patterns in favor of possibilities. But once an empath starts evaluating people based on repeated actions instead of emotional explanations, manipulation loses much of its power. And perhaps the quietest warning of all is this: they stop trying to rescue people. This is incredibly difficult for an empath because helping others has often become part of their identity. Yet eventually, they recognize a truth that philosophers and psychologists have repeated for generations. You cannot save someone who is committed to remaining exactly as they are. Growth cannot be outsourced. Healing cannot be forced. Responsibility cannot be carried on behalf of another adult indefinitely. When this realization settles in, the empath begins stepping back, not with resentment, but with wisdom. To the outside world, this can seem cold. In reality, it's one of the healthiest psychological developments possible. Because there's a profound difference between compassion and enabling. Compassion says, I care about your struggle. Enabling says, I'll carry your struggle so you never have to. One creates growth. The other quietly delays it. As these invisible warnings accumulate, the people around the empath often remain completely unaware. They mistake calm for contentment, distance for independence, silence for forgiveness. They don't realize they're witnessing the final chapter of a relationship that has been fading for months, sometimes years. And by the time they finally notice something has changed, the decision has often already been made. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but carefully, quietly. And after countless opportunities for things to be different, never ignore the quiet changes in someone who has always given you their best. The loudest warning an empath ever gives is often the one they never say out loud. At this point, something begins happening inside the empath that almost no one else can see. The battle is no longer between them and another person. It's between two deeply rooted parts of their own identity. One side says, keep loving, keep understanding, keep giving them another chance. The other side asks a question that has been waiting quietly for years. But who is protecting you? That question changes everything. For an empath, choosing themselves rarely feels natural. It often feels uncomfortable, even wrong. They've spent so much of their life measuring their worth by how much they could help, support, or heal others, that the idea of stepping back feels almost like a betrayal of who they are. Yet there comes a moment when the psychological cost of endless giving becomes impossible to ignore. This is what many people misunderstand about emotional exhaustion. They think it arrives all at once, after one terrible event. In reality, it develops gradually, through repeated experiences that communicate the same message. Your needs matter less than everyone else's. The human mind is built to notice patterns. One disappointment can be dismissed. Two can be forgiven. Three might still be explained away. But after enough repetition, the brain stops treating these moments as isolated incidents and starts recognizing them as a system. It begins connecting the dots. That's when awareness replaces hope. This shift is incredibly significant because hope has been the empath's greatest source of endurance. Hope convinces them that patience will eventually be rewarded. Hope whispers that one more conversation, one more act of kindness, one more sacrifice might finally inspire change. Hope gives meaning to suffering. But hope becomes dangerous when it ignores evidence. There is a philosophical idea that says wisdom begins the moment we stop confusing possibility with probability. Anything is possible. Someone can change. Relationships can heal. Trust can be rebuilt. Those things happen every day. But possibility alone cannot become the foundation of a healthy life. Probability matters. Patterns matter. Repeated behavior matters. An empath eventually realizes they have been living inside possibility while reality has been quietly telling a different story. That realization hurts, not because they suddenly stop loving the other person, but because they recognize that love itself has never been the missing ingredient. If love alone could transform another human being, countless broken relationships would never have existed. The empath often gave more love than anyone could reasonably expect. The missing ingredient was always mutual responsibility. Healthy relationships require two people carrying emotional weight together. And unhealthy relationships slowly becomes one person carrying both lives. Think about that image for a moment. Imagine walking through life with a backpack that keeps getting heavier. But instead of removing weight, someone continues placing more inside. At first you adjust. You tell yourself you're strong enough, then your pace slows. Your shoulders begin to ache. Eventually, every step requires effort. The problem isn't that you've become weak. The problem is that no one was meant to carry that much alone. This is where self-respect begins quietly entering the conversation. Many people think self-respect is confidence or pride. It isn't. Self-respect is the internal belief that your emotional well-being deserves protection. It means recognizing that your kindness should never require your destruction. For an empath, this realization can feel almost revolutionary, because for years, they may have believed that unconditional love meant unconditional access. They confused acceptance with unlimited tolerance. They believed that if they were truly compassionate, they should continue understanding no matter how painful the circumstances became. But compassion without boundaries eventually becomes permission. Permission for disrespect. Permission for manipulation. Permission for imbalance. And perhaps most tragically, permission for self-neglect. There's an interesting psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance. It occurs when our beliefs and our experiences no longer match. The empath believes they are helping someone by continually sacrificing for them, yet their experience keeps producing exhaustion, anxiety, disappointment, and emotional isolation. The mind cannot comfortably hold those contradictions forever. Eventually, something has to change. Either reality must change, or the belief must. For many empaths, this is the exact moment their identity begins transforming. They stop asking, "How can I save this relationship?" and begin asking, "Why have I believed that saving this relationship was entirely my responsibility?" Notice how different those questions are. The first assumes ownership over another person's choices. The second restores ownership over your own. That shift is the beginning of emotional freedom. Another fascinating aspect of this stage is that guilt often appears before peace does. The empath feels guilty for saying no, guilty for canceling plans, guilty for creating distance, guilty for refusing to solve problems they didn't create. Why? Because people become conditioned by repetition. If you spent years placing everyone else's needs ahead of your own, choosing yourself will initially feel unfamiliar. The unfamiliar often feels wrong, even when it's healthy. But unfamiliarity is not evidence of failure. Sometimes it's evidence of growth. Think about learning any new skill. At first it feels awkward. Speaking a new language feels awkward. Exercising after years of inactivity feels awkward. Setting boundaries after years of self-sacrifice feels awkward too. Growth rarely feels natural in its early stages. It feels uncomfortable because you're building a different version of yourself. This is also the point where many relationships begin revealing their true nature. Healthy people adapt when you establish boundaries. They respect them, even if they need time to adjust. Unhealthy people often resist because your boundaries interfere with the benefits they once received. That reaction tells you more than words ever could. When someone becomes angry because you refuse to abandon yourself for their comfort, they've unintentionally revealed the role they expected you to play. The empath notices this. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. And once they see it, they can't unsee it. The illusion begins dissolving. They no longer confuse being needed with being loved. They no longer mistake emotional dependence for genuine connection. They recognize that constantly rescuing someone can sometimes prevent that person from ever taking responsibility for themselves. Ironically, stepping back can become the most compassionate action available. Not because it feels good, because it allows truth to replace illusion. As this internal battle comes to an end, something remarkable happens. The empath doesn't become less caring. They become more discerning. Their compassion remains intact, but it is finally guided by wisdom instead of guilt. They understand that protecting their peace is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of responsibility. They realize that every healthy relationship begins with one essential principle. If you continually abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable, eventually there will be nothing left of you to give. And that is the moment self-respect quietly becomes stronger than the fear of letting go. Once the empath has crossed that internal threshold, something remarkable happens. It is also the stage that almost nobody understands because it doesn't resemble the dramatic endings people expect. There is no explosion, no elaborate revenge, no desperate attempt to make the other person feel guilty. In fact, what often surprises people the most is how calm the empath becomes. That calmness is frequently misunderstood. People assume the empath has forgiven everything. Others believe they've simply become emotionally stronger overnight. Neither explanation captures what's actually happening. The reality is much deeper. The final stage of an empath's patience is not emotional intensity, it is emotional detachment. And those are two completely different psychological states. Most people associate detachment with becoming cold or uncaring, but genuine emotional detachment is neither of those things. It isn't hatred, it isn't bitterness, it isn't pretending someone never mattered. Instead, it is the quiet acceptance that you can no longer invest your emotional energy where it is consistently devalued. Think about the journey that brought the empath to this point. They listened. They explained, they forgave, they waited, they hoped, they sacrificed, they questioned themselves more than they questioned anyone else. By the time they finally detach, they have usually exhausted every emotional strategy they know. That's why this stage feels so peaceful. The internal debate ends. There is no longer a daily argument inside their mind asking whether they should stay or leave, speak or remain silent, hope or let go. The decision has already been made internally. Everything afterward is simply catching up to that decision. One of the most fascinating concepts in psychology is that the human brain seeks closure, not necessarily justice. People often believe they need one final conversation, one perfect apology, or one undeniable explanation before they can move on. But closure rarely arrives from another person. More often it arrives when your own mind accepts reality without demanding that reality become different first. That's exactly what happens here. The empath stops negotiating with reality. They stop trying to rewrite another person's character. They stop waiting for consistency from someone whose behavior has consistently lacked it. Instead, they accept what has been demonstrated over time. Acceptance is incredibly powerful because it removes illusion. Illusion requires emotional energy. Reality does not. There's also something else that changes, something subtle yet profound. The empath no longer feels the need to prove their value. Earlier in their journey, they may have believed that if they loved enough, supported enough, or understood enough, they would eventually receive the same treatment in return. That belief quietly disappears. Not because they stop believing in kindness, because they stop believing kindness has to be earned through self-sacrifice. This shift often confuses the people around them. Someone who once responded instantly now takes their time. Someone who once apologized for everything stops apologizing for existing. Someone who once chased every misunderstanding simply lets silence remain. To an outside observer, this can seem like indifference. It's actually emotional independence. There's an enormous psychological difference between needing someone to validate your peace and creating peace for yourself. The empath begins choosing the second option. Another interesting transformation happens during this stage. Fear begins disappearing. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, because attachment has changed. Fear often grows from the possibility of losing something we desperately believe we cannot live without. But once the empath accepts that their peace matters more than preserving unhealthy connections, that fear starts dissolving. They no longer fear disappointing people who repeatedly disappointed them. They no longer fear rejection from those who never truly accepted them. They no longer fear walking away because emotionally, they've already completed the journey. Many people mistake this for emotional numbness. It isn't. Numbness blocks all feeling. Detachment restores emotional choice. That's a critical distinction. The empath still feels compassion. They still wish others well. They still recognize suffering when they see it. The difference is that compassion no longer overrides discernment. They can care about someone without carrying them. They can understand someone's pain without accepting mistreatment. They can forgive without reopening the same wound repeatedly. This is wisdom replacing obligation. And here's where people often become shocked. The manipulative patterns that once worked suddenly stop working. Guilt no longer produces compliance. Anger no longer creates fear. Promises no longer erase patterns. Emotional pressure no longer controls decisions. Why? Because manipulation depends on emotional hooks. It requires access to unresolved guilt, hope, insecurity, or fear. The empath has slowly removed those hooks, not by becoming harder, by becoming clearer. Clarity is one of the strongest forms of psychological protection because it requires very little effort to maintain. Confusion drains energy, clarity conserves it. Imagine cleaning a fogged window. The outside world hasn't changed. The people around you haven't changed. What changes is your ability to see them accurately. Once that window becomes clear, it's nearly impossible to convince yourself the fog still exists. That's exactly what emotional clarity feels like. The empath finally sees actions without constantly editing them through compassion. They stop translating disrespect into misunderstanding. They stop translating inconsistency into temporary stress. They stop translating repeated harm into accidental mistakes. Reality becomes enough. This transformation also changes the way they experience loneliness. Earlier, they feared being alone because they associated solitude with abandonment. Now they discover something unexpected. Being alone is far less painful than constantly feeling alone in the presence of someone who refuses to truly see you. That realization becomes liberating because it teaches one of life's deepest psychological truths. Connection and proximity are not the same thing. You can sit beside someone every day and still feel emotionally invisible. You can spend time alone and feel deeply connected to yourself. Once the empath discovers that difference, unhealthy relationships lose much of their emotional power. This is also why people often say, they changed. In one sense, they're right. The empath did change, but not in the way most imagine. Their kindness didn't disappear. Their generosity didn't vanish. Their compassion wasn't destroyed. What disappeared was the belief that love requires endless self-abandonment, and that's an entirely healthy evolution. They become more selective, not less loving, more observant, not more suspicious, more peaceful, not more distant. The final stage of an empath's patience isn't about shutting the world out. It's about finally opening the door to themselves. And once that door opens, something extraordinary happens. The energy that was once spent chasing unavailable people becomes available for growth, purpose, creativity, meaningful relationships, and genuine peace. The greatest surprise is that the empath doesn't feel victorious. They feel free. Freedom has a very quiet sound. It doesn't